Welcome to Russian History Retold, episode 351, The Battle of Berlin, the human story. Last time, we covered the Kronstadt Rebellion of 1921. Today, we head 24 years into the future to cover the last major battle in the Soviet war against Nazi Germany, the Battle of Berlin. This battle has kind of a personal note to it. My mother, Anna, was in Berlin for part of this time, and she was on the run from the Soviet Red Army, who had a bounty on her head after she escaped from being a translator for a Soviet general. She knew that if she stayed, she would eventually be sent to a gulag or shot. The books that I will be using include two that have first-hand accounts of what happened when the Red Army entered Berlin. The first is by an anonymous person called A Woman in Berlin, 8 Weeks in the Conquered City, and Eyewitness to History. I will also be using a number of other sources to get both sides of the story. One of the things I want to capture and share in this episode is the human aspect of the Battle of Berlin. As I mentioned, my mother was there, and she shared a few stories about it as I grew up. Much of what happened she buried deep inside, but I could always feel the angst it caused. That is why I'll be sharing some first-hand accounts of the fight and not focus too much on the actual battle. The official start date of the Battle of Berlin is April 16, 1945, with the end coming on May 2nd. In my historical opinion, the real start was in November 1943 as the Berlin Air Offensive. It was a joint offensive between the RAF of Great Britain and the United States Air Force. The objective of the aerial bombing of Berlin, which coincided with other strategic bombing raids on Nazi Germany, was to bomb them into submission, bringing a swift end to the war before the Soviet Union's Red Army could march in. This would prove to be an utter failure. This would also anger Joseph Stalin, as he felt that the Allies should have committed ground troops into action instead of relying on air superiority. Stalin had no problem throwing millions of men at the Germans, costing countless lives. The Allies could not do so, as the pushback from their citizens at home would have been more than they could manage. Also, the U.S. was fighting on two fronts, one in the West and the other against the Japanese. What Stalin refused to acknowledge was that while the airstrikes were never going to win the war, it would significantly weaken the Germans and allow for an earlier end to hostilities. As we know, the Allies wouldn't invade Western Europe until June 6, 1944, which made the Germans fight a two-front war. One of the things that benefited the Soviet Red Army from the aerial bombings is that it caused the Wehrmacht to shift a large number of men from the Eastern Front towards both defending German cities and the Western Front in anticipation of that Allied landing in France. On June 22, 1941, the German Wehrmacht, along with Waffen-SS and Einsatzgruppen units, and the Luftwaffe, invaded the Soviet Union in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. The Germans sent in approximately 3 million soldiers, along with close to 700,000 men from their Axis allies. What they would do to the Soviet soldiers and citizens was as close to genocide as can be imagined. Between June 22nd and December 5th, 1941, 5 months and 13 days, the German army suffered 1 million casualties, and the Soviet army had about 4.5 million casualties. On top of that, the Axis captured 5 million Soviet Red troops on the Eastern Front and deliberately starved to death or otherwise killed 3.3 million prisoners of war, as well as millions of civilians. This would haunt the soldiers and build a type of rage within the Red Army, which would boil over when they entered German territory. They would be out for revenge. The Battle of Berlin would be the culmination of this anger. When Barbarossa ended, the German army had failed to reach its goal. It was known as the AA line, also known as the Arkhangelsk and Astrakhan line. It was approximately 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers, or 900 to 1,200 miles, in a straight north-south line. It was meant to be able to access Soviet petroleum stores and production, so this failure was especially important. One of the objectives of the Nazi invasion was known as Generalplan Ost. It was the plan for the settlement and Germanization of captured territory in Eastern Europe, involving the genocide, extermination, and large-scale ethnic cleansing of Slavs, Eastern European Jews, and other indigenous peoples of Eastern Europe, categorized by the Nazis as Untermenschen, or under people, the low people. Ilya Ehrenberg, one of the premier Soviet war correspondents, wrote the following in the Red Star, the official Red Army newspaper, quote, "The Germans are not human. If you have killed one German, kill another. There is nothing better than German corpses. Don't count the miles you have traveled. Count the number of Germans you have killed." It went on and on from there, but it was even too gruesome to share. I mean, it was really horrific what the Soviets were telling their soldiers to do. Now, it was under these pretenses that the Soviet Red Army would conduct their version of revenge. In the Battle of Berlin, they would unleash their frustrations. On the other side, the Germans knew what was about to befall them, and they would act with very much the same savagery, although at times against their very own people. There is one addition to the hatred that the Soviet Red Army soldiers had, and it was brought out by Antony Beevor, who wrote the introduction to the book A Woman in Berlin. Quote, "But not all of the soldiers' anger came in response to atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht and the SS in the Soviet Union. Many soldiers had been so humiliated by their own officers and commissars during the 4 years of war that they felt driven to expiate their bitterness, and German women presented the easiest target. Polish women and female slave laborers in Germany also suffered." Just prior to the attack on Berlin, the Allies would meet at Yalta from February 4th to 11th, 1945. American President Roosevelt was only 2 months from passing away and was noticeably weak, something that Stalin would take advantage of. Winston Churchill would be isolated at times, with Stalin and Roosevelt holding private talks on how to divide Europe after the now near certain defeat of Germany coming soon. This would also be the last time the three would meet, as Churchill would be ousted in the next UK election, replaced by Clement Attlee, when the three allies would meet at Potsdam, beginning on July 17, 1945. And of course, the new president of the United States would be Harry S. Truman. The final assault on Berlin would begin on April 16, 1945, with a massive artillery bombardment. The number of bombs that rained down on Berlin from the Soviet artillery was greater than the combined total of aerial bombings by the Allies during the whole course of the war to date. The Red Army would begin their attacks on the city from 3 fronts: the east, south, and north. The Soviet troops were led by Marshals Rokossovsky, Zhukov, and Konev. The Germans, who were led by Generals Henrici and Schroner, had developed a strategy to defend the city by merging the remaining elements of Army Group Vistula and Army Group Center. This would be known as Operation Clausewitz. There were a number of orders as well attached to the defense strategy. It included the evacuation of all Wehrmacht and SS offices in Berlin, the evacuation of the central command post of the capital from General Command on Hohenzollern to the L Tower of the Zoo Bunker, and the imposition of martial law for the civilian populace, and offenses under which the death penalty was authorized. I'm going to share an eyewitness account to this final order later in this episode. The Soviet Red Army would number 2.4 million troops with about 6,200 tanks and 41,000 artillery pieces. On the German side, they had around 765,000 troops, 1,500 tanks, and about 9,300 artillery pieces. They were grossly outnumbered, but they would fight with their typical ferocity, with a nothing-to-lose attitude. Joseph Stalin, as was his habit, pitted the two lead generals, Zhukov and Konev, against each other, with the goal being to see which one would be the one to capture the Reichstag, the German parliament building. Their first order of business, according to Zhukov, was to capture the now fortress town of Kustrin. On January 25th, Adolf Hitler had ordered that that town be held at all costs, to the last man and the last bullet. The penalty for retreat was death. Kustrin lies about 70 kilometers or 42 miles east of Berlin, with its primary fortifications located in the Altstadt, or Old Town, on a peninsula at the confluence of the Oder and Wartha rivers. As Zhukov's army neared Kustrin, a horrible snowstorm hit that delayed any further action. Still, the so-called fortress was to fall to the Soviet onslaught by March. Captain Albrecht Wustenhagen would write about the state of the German defenses in Kustrin. Quote, "During the beginning of February, we finally got some light flak guns into the town. They were manned by a mixed group of Luftwaffe personnel and Hitler Youth, boys as young as 12 or 13. It was a welcome sight to see the guns, but it was disturbing to see the youths that manned some of them. We had no more men to fight, and we were now using children. Surely the war could not go on for much longer." By April 16, 1945, the Soviet Red Army was on the outskirts of Berlin, ready to enter with the full force of 3 divisions: the Soviet 2nd Belarusian, 1st Belarusian, and 1st Ukrainian fronts. As I mentioned earlier, they began with a blistering artillery barrage. Then they began to enter the city and fight the Germans that remained in hand-to-hand combat. It would be a brutal 16-day fight. Hitler would make his last public appearance on his birthday, April 20th, where he would award Iron Crosses to boy soldiers of the Hitler Youth, who would then go out and try to fight on the front lines against the invading Red Army. And many of these boys were between 13 and 15 years of age. By April 25th, Berlin was totally encircled as Marshal Konev's forces met Zhukov's in the southeast of the capital city. Adolf Hitler would become delusional in his belief that he could still muster enough forces to counterattack the Red Army and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. While there was really no hope of any sort of victory, teams of SS fanatics roamed the city, executing their fellow citizens if they felt that they should be armed and fighting the Soviets. Here's what Klaus Fuhrmann would write about the SS, what they were doing in those final days. Quote, "Panic had reached its peak in the city. Hordes of soldiers' stations in Berlin deserted and were shot on the spot or hanged on the nearest tree. A few, clad only in underclothes, were dangling on a tree quite near our house. On their chests they had placards reading, 'We betrayed the Fuhrer.' The werewolf posted leaflets on the houses. 'Dirty cowards and defeatists. We've got them all on our lists.' The SS went into underground stations, picked out among the sheltering crowds a few men whose faces they did not like, and shot them then and there. The scourge of our district was a small one-legged Hauptscharführer of the SS, who stumped through the street on crutches, a machine pistol at the ready, followed by his men. Anyone he didn't like the look of, he instantly shot. The gang went down cellars at random and ordered them straight to the front. Anyone who hesitated was shot. The front was a few streets away. At the street corner diagonally opposite our house, Walloon Waffen-SS had taken up position. Wild, desperate men who had nothing to lose and who fought to their last round of ammunition. Armed Hitler Youth were lying next to the men of the Vlasov White Russian Army, unquote. As I said in the beginning of the podcast, I wasn't going to focus on the actual Battle of Berlin. Instead, I'm going to share actual first-hand accounts of what went on during and immediately after the fighting. This is where the human story is, and it is one of hopelessness and hope, of despair and levity, as well as survival. It comes from a number of sources, one, of course, being from a woman in Berlin, 8 weeks in the conquered city, whose author was listed as anonymous, but turned out to be journalist Martha Hillers, whose name was confirmed 2 years after her death in 2001. The other is from the book Eyewitness to History, which we just read from, the writings of Klaus Fuhrmann. The third is based on an interview with Gerda Drews, who was 17 when Berlin was attacked. The Battle of Berlin was to cause the deaths of over 250,000 men, women, and children, both civilian and soldiers. The city would surrender on May 2nd, 1945, with fighting to continue sporadically for about another week. Hitler, of course, would commit suicide on April 30th. The despair in Berlin was enormous. The women knew that the Soviet soldiers had done to others as they crossed the German countryside. The rape of German women in Berlin was estimated at between 90 to 130,000. As Gerda Drews put it by the introduction to her book when it came to Red Army soldiers, quote, "My stomach was fluttering. I felt the way I had as a schoolgirl before a math exam, anxious and uneasy, wishing that everything was already over." Beevor adds, quote, "At first things do not appear too bad. The soldiers in the street are playing with bicycles they found, trying to learn to ride them. As almost all other eyewitnesses confirm, the soldiers' first interest, as the Soviet soldiers, is in looting watches. Most have 5 or 6 strapped on each forearm. But once evening comes and they've drunk their ration of vodka, the hunt begins." The next memory is back from Gerda Drews after the Battle of Berlin was over, and they tried to go back to their farm home outside the city. Quote, "We ran across a field towards our house. Everywhere there were trenches dug by the German defenders. At the entrance to our neighborhood, there was a huge trench that we had to crawl through. But we reached home safely, and my father hid us in the cellar and covered the trapdoor with rugs and blankets. However, there was no escape. I prefer not to talk about what happened when the Russians arrived at our house and discovered us, because it's too painful. The frontline Russian troops who did the fighting, as a woman, you didn't have to be afraid of them. They shot every man they saw, even old men and young boys. But they left the women alone. It was the ones who came afterwards, the second echelon, who were the worst. They went through all the houses and took whatever they wanted. They stripped homes of every single possession, right down to the toilets." And finally, these are the emotions that the Soviet Red Army soldiers, and this is what they were feeling when they were almost done with this battle or doing it. It would be vengeance and relief. After fighting from the Soviet border to Berlin, many soldiers felt a profound sense of vengeance for the destruction of their homeland. The end of the war was described as the greatest achievement, bringing pride and the anticipation of returning home. Next, the fall of the Reichstag. The raising of the Soviet flag atop the Reichstag on May 2nd, 1945, was a pinnacle memory, symbolizing the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. The next one is interesting. It's contrasting impressions. Soldiers often noted the severe destruction of Berlin's infrastructure, but were also amazed by the quality of the German houses and amenities, often treating them as curiosities compared to rural Soviet life. Then we have widespread destruction and looting. Memories frequently involve heavy street-to-street fighting, taking souvenirs from destroyed houses, and witnessing the aftermath of the Nazi regime's collapse. And then there's the humanitarian encounters. Many survivors shared stories of the massive number of orphaned German children and civilians following the army, with some soldiers taking on a protective role. Then there was permanent psychological change. Soviet participants often remarked the brutality of the fight, combined with the sacrifice of lost friends, meant they were never the same, carrying the memories of the fields of death. The Battle of Berlin, which heralded the end of the European stage of World War II, encapsulated the ferocity and savagery of the war in one city. On May 8, 1945, the German armed forces surrendered unconditionally to all the Allied powers. While the Soviet Union could claim victory over the Germans in Berlin, was there really a victor? Thousands of people died on both sides. The recovery from the war would take decades for the Soviet side. To this day, Russia has not recovered the men lost to the war. The scars run deep. In Germany, it wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that German men began to openly discuss the rapes of their women. Many men who were alive during the war felt that they let their wives, sisters, daughters, and mothers down. A shame that some would never let go of. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as you could. This is on the 30th of April. It will be the beginning of the 16th year of the Russian Rulers History podcast, which I will be renaming to Russian History Retold finally. Join me next time when we begin a 5-part series reviewing the life and times of people we have covered in the past and see if anything different has come up about them. Our first person we will revisit is Leon Trotsky, and this is because of a book I recently picked up that was published this year, 2026, known as The Death of Trotsky. After that, we will reassess Joseph Stalin, Peter the Great, Ivan Grozny, and finally, Catherine the Great. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.